All right. Well, we are going to get started this evening. Want to welcome all of you that are here in person. Want to welcome those of you that are watching online on YouTube or Facebook. If you're watching on Facebook, I want to encourage you right now in the little lower right-hand side of your screen there as you're watching, there's a button that says share. Click on share and share it on your profile so everybody else knows what you're watching, and that'll help get the word out about this series of lectures that we're doing on health. These lecture series is happening once a month for the next 2 months, is that right? And this is number 2, and it's a series of 4 lectures. And so my name is Chris Holland, and I am the Associate Director of Hope Lives 365, which is housed here in the Living Hope Seventh-day Adventist Church. And so we are thrilled to have this series of meetings happening. We're so happy with those of you that are watching online and those of you that are here in person. For those of you that are wondering, we have plenty of room to be here right in person. We're doing these lectures in the sanctuary to make sure there is plenty of room for everybody to sit. So let's have a word of prayer to begin this evening, and then I'll make a few introductory comments and introduce our speaker for the evening. So let's pray. Heavenly Father, we are so thankful that, Lord, not only do you care about our eternal spiritual health, but, Lord, you have given us principles, guidance, and a variety of items to help us with our physical health and our mental health. And so now as we spend some time talking about physical and mental health, I pray, Lord, that you would be with Dr. Emerson and give him words of wisdom and help him to address not only the topics that he has prepared, but maybe prompt his heart if there's something else that he needs to address this evening. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, for those of you that are watching online, I want to encourage you, if you have a question about some subject that Dr. Emerson is covering tonight, or maybe even something that he's not covered, but is in the general subject area of what he's discussing, I want to encourage you, just leave a comment in the chat section. I'll actually be monitoring that and making sure that your message comes through. And at the end of the presentation, Dr. Emerson will be doing a Q&A. For those of you that are here in person, you don't need to worry about sending a message because we will give you the opportunity to ask those questions here in person. Well, I don't want to, that was a double negative. I would like to thank Yvonne Restrepo for her organization as the health ministries leader here at the Living Hope Church for this series of lectures. And so without further ado, I want to bring Dr. David Emerson up. Dr. Emerson is a man who has a lot of experience. That experience has taken him from all parts in Africa, China, Guam, South America, and throughout the U.S. He has been a lifestyle director, an international speaker on lifestyle diseases, and a certified Bredesen Alzheimer reversal physician. He completed his residency at Kettering Medical Center in Ohio. He is the father of 2 young adults and is married to his wife, Oleta, who is a cancer survivor of 13 years. He is currently serving as the medical director for a lifestyle center that will be offering a cancer support session beginning in July. Dr. Emerson's passion is to watch people reclaim their health by implementing simple lifestyle changes. And so, Dr. Emerson, we want to welcome you once again, and the rest of the time is yours.
I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'd like to introduce to you Tony. Before I do, I always like to start with a short prayer. Dear Father in heaven, I pray you be with us. Show us your plan for preventing diabetes and, in many cases, reversing it. We ask your presence in Jesus' name. Amen. So, Tony, we had just returned from Guam. We'd served out there for about 8 years in our little medical missionary clinic there. And we set a practice in Ardmore, Oklahoma. And Tony was one of her first patients. She was a 66-year-old female with diabetes, and she rolled into her office in a wheelchair. I thought, why is she in a wheelchair? Well, because at 5'3", she weighed 325 pounds, which was more weight than her knees could handle. Tragically, she was also blind from her diabetes. She also had hypertension, high blood pressure 180 over 90, when it should have been around 130 over 80. She could afford only one of her 2 blood pressure pills. She was on a statin medication to lower her cholesterol, but her cholesterol with the medication was 200, which is normal for Americans. However, the normal American dies of a heart attack and stroke, so 200 was not too comforting for her. To control her blood sugar, she needed 44 units of insulin a day. Now, to give you a perspective, the normal pancreas only produces 30 units of insulin a day. Why was she needing 44? You think if she lost her pancreas completely, she'd only need 30. Well, she was resistant to the effects of insulin. We're going to talk about that shortly. So what do I tell her? Well, I could tell her diabetes is genetic. There's nothing we can do about it except keep taking the medications and wait for complications, which include heart attack, stroke, kidney failure, and amputations. Diabetes is rampant in Guam, and many times we see people in wheelchairs with no feet. It's a horrible disease. I could tell her she's doomed to carry her weight the rest of her life, or I could tell her about God's plan for a healthy body, a plan that many times can eliminate the need for medications, a plan actually instituted in the Garden of Eden. And God said, "Behold, I've given you every green herb bearing seed which is upon the face of the earth, and every tree in which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed, to you it shall be for meat." And that's the King James word for food. So what did I tell her? Well, first of all, is diabetes genetic? Well, genetics can increase your predisposition for diabetes, but if you make the right choices, you can avoid getting it. For instance, 1901, a German endocrinologist, diabetic specialist, surveying the Pima Indians in the western United States, he could only find one diabetic in the whole tribe. But about 100 years later, 1998, 50% of those over the age of 35 had diabetes. What happened? Did their genetics change? Genetics don't change that fast. What happened? Their diet changed. It became westernized. So genetics can predispose the Pima Indians to diabetes, but on a plant-based diet, they didn't get it. Dr. Murdock, endocrinologist, Loma Linda University, said genetics loads the gun, but environment, that is your choices, pulls the trigger. So you can have a genetic predisposition to diabetes, a loaded gun, just don't pull the trigger with poor health choices. Is what happened to the Pima Indians also happening to the rest of us? Between 1958 and 1994, a span of 36 years, the prevalence of diagnosed cases of diabetes increased, what's the screen say? Is that 5%? 50%? It's 500%. That's an epidemic, and a recent survey showed no abatement of the diabetes epidemic. Have our genetics changed the last 50 years? No. Have our eating habits changed? They actually have. So it brings up the next question: can what we eat actually cause diabetes? Well, Dr. Sweeney asked that question as far back as 1927. He believed he could cause diabetes if he just changed the diet. So first, he tested some medical student subjects for diabetes to make sure they didn't already have diabetes. He did a glucose tolerance test. He gave the fasting blood students 75 grams of glucose in a pill, that's sugar, a sugar pill, and watched how high their blood sugars went. A normal blood sugar will rise from below 90, it'll rise to below, say, 150, and then drop down below 90 again. All 6 students fell in the normal range. They didn't have diabetes. They didn't have pre-diabetes. Then Dr. Sweeney fed them 2 days of olive oil, butter, mayonnaise made with egg yolks, and 20% cream. He did a glucose tolerance test and giving them the sugar pill, but now 4 of them revealed sugar levels between 150, well, over 150, which put them in the class called pre-diabetes. They were heading for diabetes. The other two, at 2 hours, had blood sugars over 200, and that qualifies them for diabetes. They actually had diabetes at that point. Now, fortunately, put them back on a healthy diet, and the insulin resistance, the diabetes went away. But notice how diabetes is diagnosed. One way to diagnose diabetes is a hemoglobin A1C of 6.5. What is a hemoglobin A1C? Well, hemoglobin's a protein, and if your blood sugars are very high for a long period of time, that sugar will combine with that protein hemoglobin and produce hemoglobin A1C. If 6.5% of your hemoglobin is bound to that sugar in the form of hemoglobin A1C, that's diagnosis of diabetes. If you have a fasting blood sugar, that's a blood sugar before breakfast of 126, that's another diagnosis of diabetes. You can get a rough estimate if you have a glucometer, a little finger prick at home. You can test your blood sugars at home. But be careful, because the finger stick blood sugars you do at home have a plus and minus 15% error. So if you get a blood sugar of 100, it could be as low as 85, or it could be as high as 115. So if you want a more accurate way of measuring it, you need to have your blood drawn and sent to a lab. If you have a random blood sugar after eating of 200 or more, and you have symptoms of increased thirst and increased urination, that is a diagnosis of diabetes. Or if you do the test Dr. Sweeney did, give someone 75 grams of glucose in the form of a sugar pill, and then check your blood sugar at 2 hours, and if it's over 200, that's diabetes. So what was exactly happening to the medical students when they ate the high animal fat and processed foods? Processed fats, that is. To understand, we need to look at how the pancreas regulates the blood sugar. What was happening to the medical students before they ate the high-fat diet? Well, when they took the sugar pill, the blood sugar rose as the sugar entered the blood. The pancreas sensed this and said, I'd better bring the blood sugar back down, so it released insulin into the bloodstream. Insulin is a hormone that acts like a key. The insulin key then went to the insulin receptors, or keyholes, in the cells of the muscles, the livers, the fat, and the other cells in the body, and unlocked the doors so the glucose could enter. The sugar then entered the cells to be burned for energy or stored for later use. And this, of course, lowered the blood sugars back to a normal fasting level. In a normal person, the pancreas prevents the blood sugar from ever going above, say, 140 to 150. Well, what happened to the medical students after eating the oils and the dairy products for 2 days when they took the sugar pill? Well, the fat in the high-fat foods entered the bloodstream. Then it moved into the insulin receptor keyholes and plugged them up. Then later, when the sugar entered the bloodstream, the pancreas sensed this and released insulin key to unlock the doors to the cells, but it couldn't because the insulin receptor keyholes were plugged up with the fat. So when the sugar tried to enter the cells, it couldn't. It couldn't get in, and because the doors were still locked, and so the sugar just accumulated in the blood, and you had high blood sugars. And this is how diabetes type 2 is produced. But are all fats bad? Didn't God make high-fat foods like olives? Well, preliminary studies imply that it's oxidized fats that cause insulin resistance. Olives, which are high in fat, that cause insulin resistance are also high in antioxidants, the antioxidant glutathione. And this antioxidant glutathione protects the fats in the olives from oxidizing and causing insulin resistance. However, when you make olive oil, that antioxidant is removed. And so olive oil by itself can be oxidized and then cause insulin resistance. There was a lady in the 1800s, Ellen White, who I believe had wonderful insights from God. She said something interesting. She said, olive oil is eaten in the olive is most beneficial. She didn't say olive oil is eaten out of the olive is beneficial. And now we're starting to understand why. Because olive oil in the olive is protected by the antioxidants. But when extracted, it has no protection. Well, diabetics sometimes notice that in the morning their blood sugars are high, even though they haven't eaten anything all night. Why is this? Well, your liver contains about 24 hours worth of starch called glycogen. During the day, starch and sugar is eaten, and the sugar enters the bloodstream. Then the pancreas releases insulin, which is a key, and the insulin key then moves to the insulin receptors, the keyhole in the liver, and opens the door to the liver to allow sugar to enter the liver, but not to leave. And this allows the sugar to enter the cells of the liver and form a chain of sugars called glycogen. So if you were to stop eating today, you've got about a 24-hour supply of glycogen in your liver. It's a starch that will keep you going for about 24 hours. If you starve yourself beyond that, your liver has no more glycogen, then you go into starvation. You start burning up fat and muscle, and that's a whole different process. Now, at night when you fast, you're not eating and the blood sugars drop. To prevent the blood sugar from dropping too low, the pancreas releases insulin, and the insulin blood level drops. With the insulin blood level low, sugar can no longer leave the blood and go in the liver cells, and this prevents the blood sugar level from dropping further. But the blood sugar is still low, so how do we bring it up? Well, the liver with its glycogen comes to the rescue. It estimates how low the blood sugar is by looking at what the insulin level is. If it feels very little insulin in the insulin receptor keyhole, the liver concludes the pancreas must have stopped releasing insulin because the sugar is too low. So the liver says, I'll fix it. I'll turn this glycogen back into sugar, put it into the bloodstream, and keep the blood sugar up. So the glycogen starch now turns to sugar and leaves the liver and enters the blood. But what happens on a high-fat diet? Well, during the day, the fat enters the bloodstream, the fat enters the insulin keyhole. Then at night, when the blood sugars drop, the liver wants to sense how much insulin is in the bloodstream, and it says, wow, I can't sense any insulin in the bloodstream because this fat's plugging up the keyhole. It thinks the blood sugar is very low, and so it says, I better fix it. It panics. It releases more and more sugar into the bloodstream, and in the morning you have very high blood sugars, not because of what you ate 12 hours ago, but because of insulin resistance. Your pancreas, your liver thinks the blood sugar is too low. So, a fasting blood sugar is a simple way of testing for insulin resistance. Okay, has anyone heard that sugar is the real problem in diabetes type 2? It was a belief, you've heard of this? Yeah, it's a common belief. Dr. Sweeney wanted to test this belief, and so he took the medical students and he said, you know, if the blood sugar, the reasoning goes like this. If the blood sugars are high, that must mean we're eating too much sugar or too much starch. And so they recommend eating protein and fat. But are the carbohydrates the real problem? So Dr. Sweeney wanted to find out. So he took the medical students again, and this time he fed them a high carbohydrate diet. He gave them sugar, candy, pastries, white bread, baked potatoes, syrup, bananas, rice, and oatmeal. After eating this for 2 days, a glucose tolerance test showed them all to be in the normal range, as shown on the left graph up there. So he couldn't produce one pre-diabetic with lots of sugar and starches, but he was able to do it in 2 days on a high-fat diet. Now, I'm not advocating refined sugar in the form of candy and pastries. These are poor in nutrients. However, the sugar is eaten in the fruits is healthy because they are rich in antioxidants and phytochemicals. Also, the fiber in the fruits can help release the sugar a little bit more slowly into the bloodstream, and God made it that way. Now, to confirm Dr. Sweeney's conclusions, Dr. Anderson, years later at the University of Kentucky, essentially repeated Dr. Sweeney's experiment in 1973. He was able to turn lean, healthy individuals into mild diabetics by giving them a diet in which 65% of their calories were from fats. He also challenged the common belief that sugar caused diabetes. So to test this, Dr. Anderson thought, well, maybe Dr. Sweeney wasn't trying hard enough with just 2 days and with just some sugar and candy. I'm going to try harder. I'm going to give him a pound of sugar a day, not just for 2 days, a week, for 11 weeks. A pound of sugar a day for 11 weeks. And after 11 weeks, he could not produce even one diabetic, not even one pre-diabetic. Insulin resistance was not caused by the high sugar intake. Dr. Brunzell also asked if sugar intake was the primary problem in diabetes. He changed the diet of patients with mild diabetes from one containing 45% sugar to one containing 85% sugar. Fasting blood sugars actually fell, and they were actually getting better. So what have we seen so far? We can make someone a type 2 diabetic with lots of fats and oils, and we can cure these new type 2 diabetics with elimination of the fats and oils. And sugar is not the primary cause of type 2 diabetes. Now, what would happen if we did Dr. Sweeney's experiment on a whole island of people, like the island of Nauru? Well, after World War II, phosphorus became very valuable on this little island in the Pacific and was found in large amounts in the bird dung deposited over thousands of years. They became the wealthiest per capita nation in the world. Now, what do you do when you have money? Well, what they did is they imported all the Western foods. They would have 2 or 3 meat dishes per meal. Their fat intake increased, fiber intake decreased, and 40 years later, 1 out of 3 natives over the age of 15 had diabetes. Obesity and atherosclerotic complications became very common. Well, just after World War II, the Navy of the Micronesian Islands conducted a survey to find the incidence of diabetes. They surveyed it and they could not find any diabetes. However, now in the islands like Guam, diabetes is their number 1 problem. Heart disease is their number 2 problem. A banner at the University of Guam told us why. We went there to see the Nutcracker Suite, and a big advertisement on the side, Spam, the flavor of Guam. It's considered a delicacy there. Now, in the late 70s, countries that had low-fat, high-fiber, plant-based diet had little diabetes. Africans, Asians, Polynesians, but 40 years later, their diets are becoming westernized, and they're starting to experience the diabetes we have. A year and a half ago, we did some talks in China, and they have all our fast food places up and down their cities. So remember Dr. Sweeney's experiment. He fed 6 medical students a high-fat diet for 2 days and produced early diabetes. What if you took a whole nation and gave them the same diet? What would you expect to produce? Well, you'd expect to produce diabetes, and that's exactly what we're doing. The fats and oils in our diet constitute about 40 to 50% of our calories, and it's causing insulin resistance. Remember, between 1958 and 1994, a span of just 36 years, the prevalence of diagnosed cases of diabetes increased 500%. And more recent surveys showed no abatement in the diabetes epidemic, and now we know why. This increase was dramatic. I remember when I went to medical school, I read about diabetes. I thought, I wonder if I'm ever going to see a diabetic. And today, it's the bread and butter of internists. So far, we've seen that a diet containing animal fats and processed fats increases insulin resistance by plugging up the insulin receptors. When we eat carbohydrates, this causes a normal, healthy rise in blood sugars. The pancreas releases insulin, but the fat in the insulin receptor keyholes prevents the insulin from opening the doors to the cells. This prevents the sugars from entering the cells to be burned, and this leaves the sugar in the blood, causing very high, unhealthy blood sugars, and that's diabetes type 2. Now, did others besides Dr. Sweeney demonstrate insulin resistance? Actually, they did. In 1935, using controlled experiments, Sir Harold Hemsworth, MD, at University Hospital in London, showed that increasing the fat in the diet caused patients to become resistant to the insulin so that more insulin had to be injected. He showed that the level of the blood sugar constantly changes in response to the amount of fat in the diet. This is important because patients with diabetes are typically taught to count their carbohydrates, their sugars and their starches, and adjust their insulin dose based on that. And they're not taught to pay attention to the fats, the processed fats, the refined fats, or the animal fats in their diet. So, if 10 units a day is controlling my blood sugars for the first week, if the second week I happen to be eating a higher fat diet because I'm not paying attention to the fats, that same 10 units isn't going to work because the insulin resistance has increased and blood sugar is going to go high. I'll say, why are they high? They were controlled last week. And then the next week, if by chance you happen to be on a very low-fat diet, insulin resistance will drop, and that same 10 units is going to drop your sugars too low. And so many patients have very difficult time controlling their blood sugars from one week to the next because they're not paying attention to things that can cause insulin resistance. In 1964, Dr. Felber showed that a high-fat diet in non-diabetics raised their insulin levels by 35%. Why would that be? Well, what happens is the pancreas, normally releasing 30 units of insulin a day, when there's insulin resistance, it finds that those 30 units, it's not working. What am I going to do? I'll release 40 units. So it releases 40 units and it overcomes the insulin resistance and blood sugars stay low. But the insulin levels are higher. When tested on these patients that had higher insulin levels, they also fell into the diabetic range just from that high-fat diet. Dr. Felber actually said that on the high-fat diet, you can turn a pre-diabetic into a full-blown diabetic with the time-honored diet of meat and fat. Because at that time, they were treating patients with diabetes, telling them to get away from the carbohydrates. And what happens when you get away from carbohydrates, you're left with protein and fat. Because you only have 3 sources of calories: carbohydrates, protein, and fat. When you move to the protein and fat, that's the meat and the dairy products and the oils, you're going to make the problem worse. That was what was being taught back in his day in the 1930s, and some places, some dietitians today are teaching that today as well, and others are not. Others are teaching a plant-based diet. So when I share with patients about a plant-based diet, they say, oh, you don't have to talk to me about diet. I've talked to my dietitian, and I have to say, well, what did your dietitian tell you? And we have to share with them this information. A high-fat diet was later demonstrated to cause insulin resistance in animal studies. Over 34 animal studies showed the same thing. Now, drug companies have a problem. When they make a new diabetic drug, they have to test it on diabetic rats. Where do you get a diabetic rat? Because I was in Walmart last week and they weren't selling them. They have to make them diabetic, okay? How do you make a rat diabetic? Well, they know how to make a rat diabetic. This is what they do. Iwanashi and Kobayashi used fat-fed rats, the Sprague Dawley top of rats. They gave them 60% of their energy from saturated fats in the form of lard as a model of type 2 diabetes to evaluate the effect of the oral hypoglycemic agent pioglitazone as a form of therapy. So they're smart people. They know how to make rats diabetic. 15 human studies also confirm that a high-fat diet causes insulin resistance. So now, okay, a high-fat diet can lead to diabetes, but I also mentioned something called prediabetes. Is prediabetes a problem? If I have prediabetes, can I just ignore it until I have diabetes? There's a cartoon. It showed a patient sitting on the table, exam table, and asking the doctor, says, okay, doc, give me straight. How long do I have to ignore your advice. Okay, you don't want to ignore prediabetes. It turns out that individuals with insulin resistance, or prediabetes, as it's called, syndrome X, have a markedly increased risk of coronary artery disease. This was illustrated in a prospective epidemiological study of 970 men with no coronary artery disease who were followed for 22 years. The presence of hyperinsulinemia, which is a marker for insulin resistance, was associated with an increased risk of major coronary event, that is, death or a non-fatal heart attack. Now note, the most sensitive test we have for prediabetes is not actually blood sugar level in the morning, it's insulin levels. If your insulin levels are elevated, it means you've got prediabetes. It means you're requiring more insulin to keep your blood sugars normal. So you can have a normal blood sugar, but if you're requiring more insulin to achieve that, that's insulin resistance. Insulin levels should be below 4.5 fasting in the morning. They also mentioned that hyperinsulinemia, again, which is a marker for prediabetes, was associated with increases in both cardiovascular and non-cardiovascular mortality. And insulin resistance, that is syndrome X, also has been associated with abnormal liver pathology in severely obese patients, including steatosis, fibrosis, and cirrhosis. This is commonly called the fatty liver. What happens is when the insulin levels are high, not only does insulin drive sugar into cells to be burned, it drives fat into fat cells to be stored. So with insulin resistance, we get increasing obesity. And it also drives fat into the liver, causing liver inflammation and a fatty liver. If they take a biopsy of the liver, send it to the pathologist, he'll say, this is a fatty liver, but he can't tell you if this is from alcohol or diabetes. It looks the same. And if it has progressed to cirrhosis, that's fibrosis of the liver, cirrhosis, again, he can't tell you if it's from alcohol or diabetes. So this is becoming more and more of a problem. How long does it take to cause this inflammation in the liver, this process? I don't know if anyone has seen a documentary, Super Size Me. It's about a journalist who went on an all-fast food diet for 30 days, and in the midst of the process, he got the symptoms of insulin-resistant syndrome, hypertension, increased weight gain, impotence, but his liver enzymes shot up the roof. Liver enzymes are enzymes in the liver. When the liver is inflamed, these enzymes leak out into the bloodstream, and they can be measured in a blood test. His liver was inflamed in just 2 weeks. His doctor said, stop whatever you're doing. He didn't. He managed to survive 4 weeks, but it took him a year to lose the 26 pounds that he had gained during that 4-week period. So how do I know if I have prediabetes? Well, you have prediabetes if your fasting blood sugar is 100 to 125, or oral glucose tolerance test. You take the sugar pill and your blood sugar goes between 140 and 199, or a hemoglobin A1C of 5.7 to 6.4. Prediabetics are 6 times greater risk for developing overt diabetes. Now, if you're the typical American and you live long enough, you have about a 50% chance of getting diabetes or prediabetes. Here we see the incidence of prediabetes increasing with age. Does this thing? On top of that, we see the percentage of the population with undiagnosed diabetes. And if you add to that the percent of patients with diabetes, by age 65, you have almost a 43% chance of having diabetes. And these are fairly old statistics. It's much higher today. Now, we know that insulin resistance leads to diabetes. Now we know that it leads to a syndrome or a collection of diseases. And this syndrome is known by 3 names, called either syndrome X, insulin resistance syndrome, or the metabolic syndrome. These 3 names all mean the same thing. What are the diseases that occur together when you have insulin resistance? Well, they include high blood sugars in the morning, that's glucose intolerance, high blood pressure, elevated triglycerides, a low HDL, that's the good cholesterol, too little. And later, in 1988, they added the terms of central obesity and impaired hemostasis, the likelihood of a blood clot in your lower extremities, deep venous thrombosis. If you have any of the three in that box, the first 5 points, you have the insulin resistance syndrome. How common is it? Well, the young from ages 20 to 29 have a prevalence of about 6.7%, but the middle-aged from 60 to 69 have a prevalence of about 44%. Can we give rats Syndrome X? How do we, yeah, actually we can. How do we do it? Well, they fed rats a diet high in fat, 32% lard, 18% corn oil, 27% sugar, 23% casein, which is a milk protein. In 4 weeks, they had a 35% decrease in insulin sensitivity. 8 weeks, it was 60% decrease in insulin sensitivity compared with the rats on the low-fat diet. This is important because on the high-fat diet, if the diet stays the same high-fat, the insulin resistance is cumulative. It continues to increase. And as insulin resistance increases, the weight continues to go up, and blood pressures go up with it. The high-fat diet produced abdominal obesity in the rats in as soon as 4 weeks, and it continued to rise with increasing time. That's the second component of the Syndrome X. And there was a total rise in the bad cholesterol, the LDL, and the triglycerides, the fat in the blood. And that's the third part of the metabolic syndrome, all in just 4 weeks. But actually, all this is an introduction to what we really want to know is it reversible? And the good news is it is. So how do we reverse it? Well, if a high-fat diet, such as a high animal fat diet, high free oil fat diet, can produce insulin resistance, what about a low-fat diet? Can that work to reverse insulin resistance? And there's evidence that it does. At the University of Montreal, Dr. Rabinowitz did a 5-year controlled study with 100 diabetics. He put them on a low-fat diet, just dropped it to 20% of their calories. He gave them lots of carbohydrates, and the results, after 5 years, 24% were able to stop using their insulin and return to normal. The others reduced their dosage, and the patients preferred the diet over taking insulin injections. What was his conclusion? He said a potential diabetic can be transformed into a completely diabetic individual by the administration of the time-honored carbohydrate-free diet of meat and fat. Again, he's saying that back then they thought diabetes was caused by sugar and carbohydrates, so they say get rid of the sugar and carbohydrates, and if you do that, you're left with fat and protein, and that pushes you to an animal-based meat products, dairy products, free oils, because those have the protein and fat without the carbohydrates. And he says that's going to make the problem worse. And unfortunately, even today, some are still advocating this. In 1955, Dr. Sweeney repeated Rabinowitz's study. He said 5 years is a pretty long time. I think we can do better than that. So instead of just limiting the fats to 20%, like Rabinowitz did, he put 80 insulin-taking diabetics on a low-fat diet, dropped the fat to 11% of their calories using natural foods. What were his results? In less than 6 weeks, 50% were off their insulin entirely. After 18 weeks, 85% were off their insulin. Sweeney said on a very low-fat diet, the endogenous insulin, that's the insulin your body's producing, begins to exert curative effect within days. And most patients can be stabilized in such a diet plan alone, and some patients totally cured. In 1981, Dr. Anderson, he experimented with 13 diabetic patients who were on the American Diabetic Association diet of the time, which consisted of a 34% fat, 23% protein. He didn't believe the ADA diet was good enough. It had too high a fat content in his estimation. So he stopped the ADA diet. He started them on a low-fat diet of just 9% of their calories from fats, gave them a lot of fiber, a lot of starches from the plants. There's a significant lowering in blood sugar in all 13. Of the 5 patients taking the oral drugs, all 5 could stop their medications. Of the 8 taking insulin, 4 could stop their insulin in just a matter of weeks. So what are the low-fat success rates? Well, after working with diabetics for 15 years, Dr. Anderson, one of the most respected authorities in diabetes, stated 95% of patients with adult-onset diabetes on oral drugs could be off such drugs in less than 8 weeks. And 50 to 75% could normalize their blood sugars and get off insulin within weeks. Now, prior to 1986, it was concluded that high-fat diets can induce insulin resistance and diabetes. After 1986, some plant foods, which are high in fats, may actually be helpful in lowering insulin resistance. This was shown in the Nurses' Health Study, a study of 83,000 women over 14 years. They found that consuming larger amounts of vegetable fat, presumably in the plants with the high vegetable fat content, reduced the risk of diabetes. Here's a review from the Nurses' Health Study and 2 other studies asking what foods increase the risk of diabetes over time. I highlighted in orange the food groups that increase the risk. Now, it's kind of hard to read the screen, but I'll summarize it in a quote from the study. It says, all 3 exploratory scores had similar positive contributions, in other words, greater risk by food groups. The food groups that caused greater risk were the meat, processed meat, eggs, margarine, fried foods, refined grains, and caloric and non-caloric soft drinks. Now, we've discussed high-fat foods causing insulin resistance. This can explain why meat, processed meat, eggs, margarine, fried foods could put someone at risk for diabetes. But notice, refined grains and soft drinks, both diet sodas and caloric sodas, increase the risk of diabetes. There's no animal or processed fats in refined grains or soft drinks. Why do these put us at risk for diabetes? Is it because they have a higher glycemic index? Well, we can take a look at that. First of all, we'll go on here. Now, this is the same chart from the previous slide, but here the foods that decrease the risk of diabetes are highlighted in brown. And they found the negative contributors, those that decrease the risk of diabetes, varied from score to score, but with few exceptions, it was tea and whole grain consumption. Now they're saying that tea and whole grains were protectors. Now I don't recommend tea because of the other side effects of the caffeine, but whole grains provided a definite benefit. And if you look down at the bottom, also 4 out of the 5 studies indicated that fruit juice also was protective against diabetes. So fruit drinks decrease the risk of diabetes, but soft drinks increase the risk. Whole grains decrease the risk, and refined grains increase the risk. Well, why is that? What's the difference between the two? Is the problem that refined grains and soft drinks have higher glycemic indexes than whole grains and fruit juices? Well, first, what is a glycemic index? A glycemic index is, if you take 100 calories and give that to a person, if those 100 calories are absorbed very quickly, it'll cause a sugar spike, a high rise in sugar. That would be a high glycemic index food. And that would be like table sugar. If, on the other hand, I give you those 100 calories and say beans, which have a low glycemic index, that 100 calories is absorbed very slowly into the bloodstream over 5 or 6 hours and causes a very low rise in blood sugars. That would be a low glycemic index food. Same 100 calories, but a different form in which the calories are administered. So, why do refined grains and soft drinks increase the risk of diabetes, whereas whole grains and fruit juices decrease the risk? Is it related to glycemic index? Well, let's look. White bread has a glycemic index of 70. That's a refined grain. Whole grain has a glycemic index of 62, only a difference of 8 points out of a scale of 1 to 100. That's not a big difference. White rice has a glycemic index of 64. Whole grain brown rice has a glycemic index of 55. That's only 9 points out of 100 points difference, not a big difference. Orange soda has a glycemic index of 68. Raw pineapple, an index of 66. only a difference of 2 out of 100 points. And Coca-Cola has an index of 58, orange juice an index of 50, only a difference of 8 points. Again, a very low, small difference when you have a scale of 1 to 100. So if the glycemic indexes aren't that much different, what is the difference between whole grains and refined grains and soft drinks and fruit juices? I believe the answer is in the phytochemicals and antioxidants that are found in whole grains and fruit juices. These are protective against diabetes, but the refined grains and the soft drinks, these phytochemicals and antioxidants have been stripped away from those. So the question then is, well, do phytochemicals and antioxidants make a difference? Well, to answer this, remember that fats cause insulin resistance. But we now have evidence implying that it's oxidized fats that cause insulin resistance. Since antioxidants protect the fats from oxidizing, they could protect us from diabetes. So what is the evidence that oxidized fats cause insulin resistance? Well, there's an anecdotal case of a worker at one of the lifestyle centers. He had type 1 diabetes. This is a diabetes that's caused by an autoimmune disease which destroys the pancreas, so he's not producing enough insulin. Because of that, he has to inject insulin. And because of that, if he gets insulin resistance, his pancreas can't compensate for it, and his blood sugars shoot up. And so if he has a food that causes insulin resistance, blood sugars shoot up very quickly. If he has a food which does not cause insulin resistance, blood sugars can stay normal. And what he found was that peanuts he could eat, blood sugars wouldn't go high, but peanut butter, they would shoot up. Olives he could eat, no problem. Olive oil, blood sugar shot up. Peanuts, no problem. Peanut butter shot up. Almonds, no problem. Almond butter, blood sugar shot up. What's the difference? Well, Dr. Vogel, cardiologist at the University of Maryland, Baltimore Medical School, did a revealing study. Turns out that insulin is a vasodilator. It will dilate arteries. When insulin is released, nitric oxide levels rise, and this has a powerful vasodilating effect. So insulin resistance, if you're resistant to the effects of insulin, it blocks this vasodilation effect. So Dr. Vogel, he tested different foods on their ability to prevent vasodilation, implying insulin resistance. So what he did is he used ultrasound, and he measured the diameter of the arteries in the arm. Then he put a blood pressure cuff on the arm, shut off the blood supply for 5 minutes, then he released the cuff, and the arteries dilated to get blood to an ischemic arm very quickly. And that was a normal, healthy response. Then the next day, he gave these medical students 900 calories of a fast food, but no fat with it. He repeated the test. When he released the cuff, arteries dilated. The next day, he gave the students 900 calories of fast food and 50 grams of fat. This was animal fat. When he released the cuff, arteries didn't dilate. It would imply insulin resistance, something blocking the releasing effect. So he said, that was an unhealthy fat. Let's use a healthy fat. Let's use olive oil and see what it does. So the next day, he gave them 50 grams of olive oil with their meal, released the cuff, arteries didn't dilate. He said, oh my, I thought olive oil was healthy. So then he thought, well, maybe it's oxidized olive oil. So the next day, he gave them 50 grams of olive oil plus 6 capsules of antioxidants. These antioxidants capsules were dried vegetable matter, powdered up, put in capsules, and they took the capsules, and then they took the olive oil. When he released the cuff, the arteries dilated. This indicated that the antioxidants were protecting the students from the effects of the oil by preventing the oil from being oxidized. And from that, the suggestion is that it's oxidized oils that cause insulin resistance. What does it take to oxidize something, and how long does it take? I don't know if you ever cut a banana open or peeled it, set it out on the shelf in a few hours, what happens? It turns brown, it's oxidizing. Women have a trick. My wife, she'll cut up the bananas, she'll make a fruit salad, and then to prevent the bananas from turning brown, what do you add? You add lemon juice, an acid, which is an antioxidant, prevents them from oxidizing. And this is what's happening in the olives. Now, remember, Ellen White said olive oil is eaten in the olive is most beneficial. The question is, I wonder if God put antioxidants in the olive to protect us from the effects of the olive oil. So other researchers went to an olive press, and they said, we want some of your products. They said, I want some olive oil. They said, no, we want your wastewater, the stuff you're throwing away, the pulp. And they said, oh, yeah, help yourself. So they took the pulp, the wastewater, and they tested it for antioxidants, and they found huge amounts of glutathione, which is our body's main antioxidant. And that was being thrown away in the water. When they gave subjects this glutathione to drink, their glutathione levels rose dramatically in their bloodstream. And that's why olive oil, as eaten in the olive, is most beneficial. And that's why she didn't say olive oil is eaten out of the olive is most beneficial. So I encourage people, if they like the high-fat foods, get it in the whole form. Cut up your olives, put your avocados on your sandwiches, however you want to do it. Just make sure you get your antioxidants with it. And this concept of antioxidants and phytochemicals also helps us understand some other findings that other studies have shown. Whole grain consumption was associated with a lower risk of developing diabetes. This is 2 separate studies. And the effect was independent of fiber intake. The consumption of refined grains was associated with increased risk of developing diabetes, and whole grains decreased the risk of stroke and heart attack. So this evidence also suggests that the antioxidants and phytochemicals in the foods like whole grains, and which is removed to produce refined grains and flour, are protective against diabetes. So, to review, 75% of people taking insulin could be free from insulin in a few weeks. 70 to 90% of diabetics on pills could be free from their medications in a matter of weeks. This is the conclusion Dr. Anderson came to. But the question then is, if a vegan diet free of oils can stop insulin resistance in a few days, then why weren't Dr. Anderson's success rates 100%? What's going on? And we'll conclude with these thoughts. This is, the reason is beta cell burnout. What is beta cell burnout? Well, what are beta cells? This is the pancreas. Inside the pancreas are cells that produce insulin. It turns out that as one is approaching diabetes, the beta cells decrease in number, and the little granules in the beta cells which produce the insulin also decrease in number. This is called beta cell burnout. The pancreas's ability to produce insulin is declining. Now, that's okay for a while because your pancreas has a large reserve. It can produce many times, can produce much more insulin than a normal person usually needs. How does beta cell burnout contribute to diabetes? Well, this was illustrated in a study with baboons. They took some baboons that had healthy pancreas and they gave them nicotinic acid, which produced severe insulin resistance. But these baboons did not get diabetes because their pancreas was healthy and it just produced more insulin and kept the blood sugars normal. They said, well, okay, let's try something else. So they took another group of baboons, and in this group, they used a streptozyme to kill half the pancreas. So now the baboons only had half a pancreas. Now when they gave them insulin resistance from the nicotinic acid, their pancreas had no reserves. They couldn't produce that extra insulin that was needed, and they got diabetes. So for this group, you needed insulin resistance plus beta cell burnout. Also, there is a rare genetic defect in humans which causes severe insulin resistance, more severe than found in diabetes. However, many with this defect never develop diabetes because their pancreas simply produces more insulin, and it meets the increased demand. So what they found is as people are moving towards diabetes, insulin resistance is rising, but beta cell function is decreasing. Beta cell burnout is increasing, and they both progress at the same time until the diagnosis of diabetes. This was shown in a study with Japanese Americans, in a study of Mexican Americans, and a third study with Pima Indians. So then they did a study and they said, okay, at the time of diagnosis, what's the beta cell function? And what they found was that if you see the 0, that's the number of years, that's the 0 year, that's the time diabetes is diagnosed. The dot above it, if you go to the left, shows that the beta cell function was 50% of normal. So at the time of diagnosis, they had lost 50% of their beta cell function. Then, if you go to the right, 6 years after the diagnosis, it was down to about 25%. And so they asked, well, when was the beta cell function normal? So they drew a line back, and it looked like 12 years before the diagnosis of diabetes. That's when the beta cell function was normal. So this process had been going on for 12 years prior to the diagnosis of diabetes. So the question then was, well, what causes beta cell burnout? Why are they burning out? And notice that this occurred before the diagnosis of diabetes when the blood sugars were normal. So when they did some hypotheses as to what was causing beta cell burnout, the first 3 suggestions, glucotoxicity, glycosylation of proteins, amyloid deposition, those all require high blood sugars. But this was happening when the blood sugars are normal. So they excluded those possibilities and they're left with lipotoxicity. What is lipotoxicity? Well, we can ask Dr. Guyton, famous physiologist, and his successor, Dr. Hall. And it's actually, it says, lipotoxicity is the lipid that is a fat accumulation in the tissues, such as skeletal muscle, the liver, and lipid accumulation in the pancreas. What they're saying is, when you have insulin resistance, you release more insulin. That extra insulin drives fat, again, into the fat cells to cause obesity, drives fat into the liver to cause fatty liver, but it also drives fat into the pancreas, and that causes inflammation and beta cell burnout. It says in obese people, however, the pancreas gradually becomes exhausted from secreting large amounts of insulin or damaged by factors associated with lipid, that's fat accumulation in the pancreas, and full-blown diabetes develops. So beta cell burnout plus insulin resistance gives you diabetes type 2. The question now is beta cell burnout reversible? Well, there's a class of drugs that can reverse it. They're called the TZDs, the thiazolidinediones. They can reduce fasting and postprandial blood sugars. They can help reduce hemoglobin A1C levels. They can decrease insulin resistance. And they can actually help the pancreas rejuvenate with increased beta cell function. They decrease insulin resistance. They lower free fatty acid levels. And this has been shown to protect beta cells. And they can actually increase beta cell function by 62% in 6 months in one study, if started soon enough. The problem is that TZDs cause a 5 to 10 pound weight gain. And most diabetics with type 2 diabetes already have a problem with weight gain, and they don't want to welcome any more. However, with the plant-based diet can also decrease insulin resistance, lower insulin levels, and this lowers free fatty acid levels in the blood and can help reverse beta cell burnout. And it is not associated with a weight gain. It's actually associated with a weight loss. And so the plant-based option is much more preferable. The main thing to remember with beta cell burnout is that it may take 6 months to a year to reverse beta cell burnout with a healthy diet. Insulin resistance can be reversed usually in a few days, but beta cell burnout tends to take longer, 6 months to a year. And that's why Dr. Anderson's success rates weren't 100% in a short time period. It would have taken longer to get a higher percentage because you're dealing with beta cell burnout as well. So, do you remember Tony? She had diabetes, hypertension out of control. She weighed 325 pounds, 5'3", very heavy. She was in a wheelchair because her knees couldn't support her weight. What did she do? She actually did something strange, totally unexpected. She did what we asked her to do. She started on a vegan diet, no calorie restriction, no exercise. She's in a wheelchair. And in 2 months, her blood pressure dropped to 94/56. We had to stop her blood pressure medicines. In 1 year, she was off of her insulin injections. In 2 years, her weight dropped from 325 to 211, about a pound a week. How much exercise was she getting? She was in a wheelchair. She wasn't getting any exercise. She wasn't restricting her calories. She just changed the types of food she was eating, and the weight started coming off. When her weight came down, the orthopedic surgeon said, okay, now it's safe to do surgery on you. They did a knee replacement, and she started walking again. As long as she stayed on the program, she did very well. Whenever she strayed, things got worse again, but she just had to stick with the program. So now you can have a full life enjoying a plant-based diet. Consider almond milk, soy milk, or rice milk in place of dairy products. Use legumes for your protein instead of meat products. Use foods rich in healthy fats like olives, avocados, and nuts instead of the animal fats and the free oils. Add to this fruits, grains, vegetables, and you have a truly healthy diet. God desires your health. The disciple John wrote, "Beloved, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health just as your soul prospers." God has your best interest in heart. And to learn more, consider one of these insightful books. Thank you for watching. Oh, very good.
Yeah, we have some questions from our audience. One of the questions is oatmeal all right for treating diabetes? Because there are people that have breakfast every day thinking oatmeal will help.
Yeah, oatmeal is fine. It's the grains, the whole grains particularly, are a good option for diabetics. But just remember, they'll have a little bit higher glycemic index than, say, beans, the legume family. Legumes are beans, peas, and lentils, chickpeas. And for diabetics, if you can eat 1 or 2 bowls of those in the morning, that's ideal. If you can eat those with your oatmeal, that will even give you better blood sugar control.
Okay, so oatmeal helps.
Oatmeal is okay, yeah.
Okay. Dr. Emerson, what about lean meats?
Lean meats?
Yeah, that's one of the questions from our audience.
Yeah, unfortunately, they're going to be a problem. They're going to have the saturated fats in them, and there are other problems with the meat products. The animal proteins are made with amino acids that have high sulfur groups in them, and when you burn those proteins for energy, it makes your urine acidic, and it pulls calcium carbonate from the blood, goes out in the urine, and you lose calcium that way. And it's one of the animal protein, a high animal protein diet is one of the chief causes of osteoporosis in America. We find that if we're trying to get patients off their diabetic medications, the ideal diet is to shift completely away from even the lean meats and go to the legume family for their proteins instead.
Okay. Dr. Emerson, moderation and variety is a good answer to eating well?
You're saying variety?
Moderation
and variety. Yeah, you want variety. There's actually a simple way to get that variety and actually cook your meals in just 10 minutes each night. My wife and I learned about this method from a family that said, there's a speaker in your area, and we'd like to hear him, but we live 4 hours away. Can we spend the night at your place? We said, sure. And then we remembered they had 8 boys. I thought, oh no. But they said, don't worry about cooking for us. And so what they did is each night a different boy cooks the food. And what he takes is either a crock pot or an instant pot, and he chooses a legume, a different bean, either a bean or a pea or a chickpea or a lentil, and he puts it in the crock pot or in the instant pot. If it's an instant pot, he sets the timer for 5 in the morning. It'll cook it in an hour. If it's a crock pot, he cooks it all night. And then he chooses a grain, a different grain. He can have a different grain each night. A whole grain, rice. They've got brown rice, black rice. They've got all kinds of different rices. They've got quinoa. They've got, millet. Anyway, he chooses a different grain, and then in the morning, he has a grain and a legume, and then he can make it a sweet meal, like fruits, nuts, dates, raisins, oranges, whatever. And then for lunch, you can get by with taking the same grain and same legume, but now make it savory with onions, tomatoes, lettuce, whatever. And then for the evening meal, you can either skip the evening meal or have a light meal of a grain and a fruit. That's digested very easily, very quickly, and you'll get to sleep on an empty stomach, and it gives your stomach a chance to rest. And that way you can get a variety of foods if you like variety. But on the other hand, if you're like me, my wife goes on a trip and I'm stuck cooking for myself, I'll usually trick the same thing for a week or two, and that's okay too.
That's fine. Dr. Emerson, another question. Do exercise help in diabetic patients?
Yes. With exercise, the muscle cells, the doors to the sugar open without insulin. They open up, sugar enters the muscle cells and gets burned without insulin. So you can actually lower your blood sugar levels without increasing your insulin levels. And the reason that's a great plan is that, remember, if you have insulin levels, that'll push the sugar into the cells, but it'll also push fat into the fat cells to be stored, and so you risk obesity. But with exercise, you can lower your sugars without that excess insulin. And it's a very helpful way of controlling blood sugars.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Dr. Emerson, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Yeah,
It's enjoyed being
very
here.
much.
Sure.
All right, and thank you for being with us. And hopefully you will get news about our next program in the month of June. So we will let you know, we'll send you invitations, we will advertise so you can see our next topic with Dr. Emerson. Thank you for being with us. And I hope you can share the link with some others, people that you would like this information to, you would like to share this information with people who suffered from diabetes. Share the link and spread the good news. Thank you for being with us.